I would buy all of this food and I would sit there and I would eat it all in one sitting, and then I would take the wrappers and I would put them in a smaller bag and then like bury them at the bottom of the garbage, or even take them outside before my husband got home so that he wouldn't know that I had eaten all of that food. In this video, we're going to discuss a sensitive subject, and it can be triggering for some people to watch. We're going to talk about a form of disordered eating behavior in which people sneak food, eat it in secret, and then dispose of the evidence afterwards. For some people, this can be a byproduct of decades of extremely restrictive diets and creating a super unhealthy relationship with food. But then there are other extreme cases of actual binge eating disorders and even bulimia, where people will binge eat in secret and then later dispose of the evidence as a way to hide their binging and purging behaviors and avoid being discovered. These type of secretive eating habits can be indicative of an underlying mental or emotional condition. And if you feel like this video is talking about you, then it's probably best for you to seek professional help from a licensed therapist or counselor that can actually help you treat the underlying conditions that are causing this behavior. I want to start with a really personal story, and this is something I really haven't shared outside of, many people. I don't even think a lot of people in, my family or friends really knew about this. I think you knew about this, and that was pretty much it. I don't even think my husband knew, which is pretty crazy, but this is something that I engaged in for a long period of my life. And as I was growing up, I did have an eating disorder where I did binge and I did purge. And that was something that, I had to learn how to deal with and how to overcome. But as I continued my health and wellness journey, I did fall into, restrictive diet after restrictive diet. And I created a really poor relationship with food where I looked at some foods as good and other foods as bad. When I was dieting and I was constantly living in this yo-yo diet cycle, I was always trying to be as restrictive as possible, which means for me, cutting out all of the bad food, right? So I would never let myself have any of those treats that I considered to be bad. But then that would manifest itself in these type of binge episodes. I would buy all of this food and I would sit there and I would eat it all in one sitting, and then I would take the wrappers and I would put them in a smaller bag and then like bury them at the bottom of the garbage, or even take them outside before my husband got home so that he wouldn't know that I had eaten all of that food. This is the craziest part about all of this, is my husband's extremely supportive. He wouldn't care if I wanted to, eat a whole quart of ice cream, or if I wanted to,
he'd be happy about it probably.
He'd be like, go, that's great. And so this is kind of the weirdest part about all of this, is I had no reason to have to hide all of it. But this was still a behavior that I engaged in where, if I knew he was going out for the night, I was like, oh yes, like this is my one opportunity. Like I almost can't wait for him to leave. I get to go to the grocery store. I get to get all of these like treats that I never let myself have. And then I get to sit down and eat all of them like back to back to back, to the point where I almost felt sick. I wasn't enjoying it anymore. I was just eating for the sake of eating it.
Just to get it
in. And then once I was finished, like I said, I would have to dispose of the evidence. So it's almost like it never happened. And this is something that, as we've continued to grow our calorie cycling community, and we're meeting more and more women who do have a history of extremely restrictive diets, or who have created this type of poor relationship with food like I had, it's coming out more and more that this is something that's really common for women, where they are embarrassed to eat these types of foods and they feel like they need to hide it from their spouses or their kids or their friends or their families. And they'll do that same type of disordered eating behavior where they'll eat these foods in secret and then dispose of the evidence afterwards because they're so embarrassed about having to eat all of those foods. The purpose of this video is we wanted to, number one, like call attention to it and bring awareness to it, because I think it's one of those things that brings a lot of shame.
Yeah, and
people don't talk about it.
Yeah, and because of that, from our experience, when we have brought this up before in an intimate community with women that we work with, someone had shared it and other people had chimed in and they're like, oh my God, I thought I was the only person that did that.
Yeah.
And this is the problem, is that this type of behavior, it might feel like I'm the only person that must do this. Like there's something wrong with me. It's something that's actually very common. I've had instances where I've done something similar, not to the extent that you had, but it's a real thing, and it's something that a lot of women struggle with. So if you are on the other end of this video and you're watching this and you're you know, upset, if you're feeling like, oh my God, like I've done this before, like you're kind of stunned that someone's actually like calling it out and talking about it. Like it's a real thing, and it's something that we need to address and talk about, like why this is happening.
Yeah, and take the shame away from it, right? Because I think that's the hardest part, and that's something that I felt for a very long time, is I felt a lot of shame around doing it, and that's why I didn't talk to anyone about it, because I'm like, it's gross, right? Like what's wrong with me that I do that? That's also part of why we wanted to make this video, because number one, we want to take the stigma away from it and help you maybe understand if this is something that you do, why you might be doing it. And then what are some ways that you might be able to fix it if your problem doesn't run super deep? You know, I hope I'm not diminishing anyone's experience in saying this, but I think there are different levels or almost tiers to this behavior. Some that can be solved by creating a better relationship with food, which is what we see in our program. And then others where there's definitely a need for deeper therapy or counseling to treat those underlying behaviors.
I think so. There's eating disorders, and then there's disordered eating behaviors. And for this video, we are talking about a disordered eating behavior.
Yes. One thing that we notice is that we get a number of women who do come into our program who struggle with exactly this. They will be on a really restrictive diet. They have this binge episode. They hide all of, the evidence, and then they feel really frustrated, ashamed, and defeated afterward. I want to shed some light on why this might be happening to you if you find yourself in that scenario. I think the root of it can really be traced back to all of the restrictive diets that we're taught, especially as women. We're taught to constantly be on a diet. You should always be, thinner and smaller and, more petite. Like,
you shouldn't eat that. You shouldn't eat this. Like,
right.
It's almost kind of a given that, like, you're on a diet. You talk to anyone, no, I can't have that, I'm on a diet. It's just kind of part of your identity almost.
And after years or even decades of being on restrictive diets, we start to develop this warped relationship with food, or we start to assign values to food. These foods are good and they're safe and they're okay to eat, and these foods are bad and they're off limits and they'll make me fat and I can't eat them. Maybe there's even social stigma around them, like you grew up and your mom was like, you can't eat that, that's gonna make you fat. Or, hey, don't put so much butter on your potatoes because that's gonna make you fat. You don't know like maybe what those root causes are, or maybe you do, but for most of us, those types of restrictive diets and the labeling as a food as good and bad, that's one of those big things that can start to create this behavior for a lot of women. And I like to think of it this way. It's kind of like breathing through a straw. If I hand you a straw and I tell you to breathe through a straw, you're gonna be able to still breathe. You're not gonna die. But if you think about the level of breath you're gonna be able to bring in and then exhale, it's gonna feel hard. You're not going to be able to get a nice deep breath in. And eventually at some point, even though you're not dying, you're gonna get sick of breathing through that little straw, and you're gonna wanna throw the straw away, and you're gonna wanna take a big gulp of air in. Like, you're gonna wanna fill your lungs and get what you've been missing. And when you think about it in that type of an analogy, you can almost look at dieting and restrictive diets in the same way. If you're constantly grouping foods as good or safe or bad and off limits, and the majority of your life, you are only allowing yourself certain foods and you're not allowed to have any treats or any fun foods or bad foods, it's kind of like breathing through a straw. The more restrictive you are, eventually you're going to have that moment where you want to throw the straw away, and you're going to want to have or eat all of the foods that you never let yourself eat before. And once that dam breaks, it's going to be one of those scenarios where you feel like you have to get it all in, right, before you start your restrictive diet again on Monday. And because you've created this relationship with food in your head where these foods are bad, you might feel a lot of guilt or shame that, hey, I broke and I ate all of those foods, and not only did I eat them, but like I ate ridiculous quantities of them, and now I'm fearing the judgment of, oh my gosh, if anyone sees that I caved off of my diet and I ate all of these bad foods, I'm gonna feel judged, I'm gonna feel shame, so now I need to hide the evidence, that way it's only me who knows it. And one thing that we found with a lot of our clients in our calorie cycling community is once we start introducing more flexibility into dieting, you're allowed way more calories than you're used to on diets. You're allowed to incorporate those fun treats every single day. You start to repair your relationship with food nothing really feels like it's bad anymore. Nothing really feels off limits. And what we found is that our clients that come in with those disordered eating tendencies, after the first 6 weeks, most of them experience a complete reduction of those type of tendencies because they have so much more freedom and flexibility.
Yeah, and I think it really comes down to like when we're giving you permission and saying like, you have permission on this diet to eat the cookies that you've been cutting out for years, or the brownies, or the ice cream, or whatever it is that's like your kryptonite, right? And like that's the thing that like you've always overdone it in the past, and because it's been this like forbidden thing that you haven't been able to have, and now someone's saying, no, you have permission to eat this, and actually I want you to have a little bit of that every single day. Mm-hmm. That's what's called exposure therapy. Mm-hmm. And so now you're exposing yourself to this thing that you once feared. It was almost like this like forbidden thing. You almost kind of feared it because you know when you have it, you can't stop having it. So now, because of this exposure therapy, you're having it every single day. Now the desire for it isn't so strong, right? And so now it doesn't become this big thing that you've built up in your head because you're able to have it whenever you want to. And that takes the pressure off of it. And this, again, like Jess is saying, is the problem with so many diets in the women's diet industry is they put you into two camps. Either like you're good and you can have these foods and you're on plan, or you're bad and like you're off plan and you're eating these foods. And there's no gray space. And because of that, like you become a 50-year-old woman and you're afraid of food and you don't know what to eat and you're hiding wrappers in the garbage and you're doing all these behaviors that are not normal, but you've been conditioned from such a young age to do that. I think another thing that I've heard from a lot of women who, especially like they don't eat in public. Like let's say you're at, a theme park. You're really embarrassed to like sit down with a tray of food with your family and eat food. Let's say you're pretty overweight. Fundamentally, deep down, you feel like I don't deserve to eat this food because people around will look at me and say, she doesn't need that. She shouldn't be eating that. She doesn't need any more food. And so because of that, you're like, I'm not gonna eat. No, I'm not hungry or whatever. Like, I don't want it. Or you're eating it like slowly and like you're really embarrassed. If you don't eat it, then like what happens later is you get home and then that's when you overdo it in secret. So there's all these things that come into play, like depending on what your circumstances are, that are playing into why you're not eating publicly, but then you're going like in secret and eating these foods.
Yeah, for sure. We had a client who did exactly that, right? She had a really important job where she was out with clients 3 nights a week going to different dinners or events or things like that. Every time she was out with her clients, she was like, I never ate any of like the fun foods at dinners because I was always trying to be so good, right? And she was overweight. She didn't feel confident in herself, and she felt like, if I'm overweight at dinner eating these fun foods, my clients are gonna judge me. They're gonna be looking at you and be like, why are you eating these foods when you're overweight? And so she felt a lot of shame around that. After her client events, one of her big vices was I would get in my car and I would drive home, and on my way home, I'd stop at a fast food place. And I would load up on all of this fast food and I would stuff myself until I was full. And then I would dispose of all of the evidence and I would go home, right? And so she's like, to everyone else, I was always eating good. Like she said, my sister said to me at one point, like, I don't understand how you're overweight because I never see you eat anything bad. But it was always happening in secret. One other thing that we need to, to think about is the whole idea of emotional eating. A lot of us do eat our emotions, whether they're negative emotions or whether they're happy emotions. If you're sad, you're frustrated, or you're stressed, a lot of times that will drive us to emotionally eat. But the same way, when Friday rolls around and you're really excited and you've gotten through a long week, you want to kind of let your hair down and celebrate, that's also emotional eating where you might overdo it. If we tend to use food to cope with our emotions or amplify our emotions, that's also like a disordered form of eating that we need to address. But in the instance where you are disposing of the evidence after you do it, that could also be your way of trying to deny that you do have that disordered behavior of tying your emotions to food. The biggest takeaway from all of this is that, number one, we want to take like the stigma away from it because it's way more common than most people think. Number two, let's take the shame away from it and let's open up a dialogue and a discussion about it. And I don't want to normalize it, but I do want to start to help other women understand there might be more environmental things or like habitual things that you're doing, whether it's restrictive diets, whether it's certain social circles, whether it's people that you're worried are going to judge you, or whether it's your emotional eating that might be causing you to act this way. And if you are acting this way, it's time to kind of look at your environment and look at all the factors and make that determination of what needs to change in order to get you the help that you need. So whether that's stopping the restrictive diets, working with a nutrition coach to start to heal your relationship with food, or maybe even seeking out, a licensed therapist or counselor, that's on the level of the spectrum that you need to make as that decision for yourself. But we're just hoping that this video starts to open up the dialogue around it and, help other women to understand that while it's not normal, it's more common than most people think.